And thank you to everyone for joining today. I'd say it's nice to see you, but I can't actually see you, but I can feel you. I know you're there, and I appreciate it. As Amanda mentioned, I'm with the CSPS Digital Academy, which is largely what it sounds like. We're the digital business line of the Canada School of Public Service, and we tend to focus on the themes that are on the screen right now. So digital leadership, foundations, data, cloud, cybersecurity, AI, design and agile, and trending technology. But that's always evolving as we go. And generally speaking, over the last 3 years, we were launched in 2018. As Amanda mentioned, we've run hundreds of course offerings. We've had thousands of learners evaluate us and whether we're meeting their needs and goals for digital learning in the Government of Canada. We have a range of other bilats and meetings and steering committees that we get input from, and we've done some fairly large-scale surveys on what people's learning needs are. For instance, every time we get a request about something we should teach, we log it and who said it and how many times we heard it. And as you might imagine, there's people think the Government of Canada needs a lot of digital learning. And in particular, at this point, we're 3 years into our existence. And I think that makes a bit of a natural pivot point for organizations where teams are a bit bigger. They're trying to become a little bit more mature. Some of the more informal cultures and practices and just spinning your chair around to hash something out with a colleague doesn't work anymore. And so as a team, we've been taking stock of all of these sources of inputs and feedback and evaluation of what we've been doing and trying to sort that into promising practices on which to build, as well as maybe some more difficult lessons learned for ourselves and our role in the public sector. And some of these are about us as a learning organization, and some are really just because they're challenges and either promising practices or hard truths for the public sector trying to do digital. And so there's a bit of a blurry line between those two worlds. And so I'm going to start with something that isn't even a hard truth. I think this is an easy truth, and most people will agree with it, which is that digital government is a team sport. We tend to talk about this in terms of, say, multidisciplinary teams, or the need to bring service and policy teams together, or get digital out of digital teams and into, say, corporate enablers and executive ranks. But the way that we felt this most acutely was when we were running a multi-month in-depth learning program, basically based on a condensed product development lifecycle. So we were teaching people problem definition and then design research and prototyping, testing, and iteration. And essentially, we brought in public servants who went on their own miniature version of the hero's journey. So they went from the world that they knew into one of the unknown, and they had trials and failure, and they had growth and new skills, and then they went back, changed to their old world. And when they left our program, they said they felt very empowered and very excited to bring these skills back to their team. And then when we checked in about 6 months later as a follow-up, one of the phrases that was bizarrely common, that some version of this phrase came out, was that they felt like they were beating their head against a wall, which is because they went back to an organization that didn't go through that journey with them and didn't know why or how they had learned what they had learned. And everyone was working in largely the same way. So I think we actually set people up for failure, where we gave them this expectation where they could go back and transform their own organization. But really, they actually just felt like black sheep. And because we can think about skills in a few different ways. I think in 2021, whether you're managers and executives, practitioners, corporate enablers, or public servants writ large, you need user skills, which is what we would call, the ability to use technology on a day-to-day basis in your workflow, while also not being a massive security liability to your department. But the problem is that we focus on what we call professional skills for practitioners, i.e. what project and product managers and their teams would literally do in the run of a day in a product development lifecycle. And so what we were missing is what we might call context skills, which is, say, for corporate enablers and managers and executives, what teams working like that mean to their organizations in the way that they should approach their jobs and their organizations and their design decisions. So when we rebooted this more recently, we ran a successor to that program earlier this year. And this is the program for it. So we made a few changes. So basically every colored icon is a miniature learning module and a part of the journey that they went on, but we made two substantial changes. One is that we don't have individuals going through this program. We have full teams who are working on a project together for their department. And the other thing is that some of these modules are for the managers and executives of these teams. So it's not like they all go through it together, but it's more so there's a dedicated path to help the executives of teams contextualize what their teams are learning and their role in that change in those approaches. And we're not the only people to do this. I know that Code for Canada, after their first cohort of fellows into the Government of Canada, they introduced a similar model where they would run sponsoring executives through a 4-hour workshop as part of a condition for fellowship. And we do that as essentially a condition for having a team in the accelerator. The next one is much like those project managers that went back to their home departments and found that nothing had changed. This is a bizarrely recurring theme. And the thing that is interesting about it is that it's true no matter what level we're talking to, whether we're having bilats with the senior most public servants in the Government of Canada or people at more of the working level, is that absolutely no one thinks that they have the right levers for change. So a project manager might wish that things around them work differently, but if you go all the way up, it's turtles all the way up. And the senior most public servants lament the way the budget process works and our accountability frameworks and how it doesn't really fit into a problem first approach or testing and iterating, or the idea that software is never done. And I think the takeaway from this, to quote Jen Palker from Code for America, is that no one is coming. It is up to us. And this actually goes even to members of parliament. If you go back to the research from Samar from a few years ago, where they did exit interviews with MPs, and even not even MPs, but people that were ministers in cabinet would often say, and it was one of the themes that came out most strongly in Samar's research, that they wish they just could get to the next level, the slightly bigger portfolio, and then they could really enact the changes that they wanted to see. And I think the thing that we need to take from this is that the world is not going to change around us, and we need to make the best we can out of the system that is, or the way that we can change the system around us. I really enjoy Chris Wong's Law, which states that every government agency everywhere is working on a new system. It will solve all of their data problems and will be ready to use in 18 to 24 months. And this is something that I both feel in my own organization, and generally speaking, our response to this is that that's great. We should have an eye on the future. We should align towards it. We should make sure that we're being interoperable. But if we need to do something with our data right now, what can we do right now with what we have? Because I think there's a few ways for us to look at this as a community. In the first Forward 50, we were challenged to think about the change that we could make in 50 days, in 50 months, and in 50 years. So this is what we can do as a short game and what we can do as a long game. So the short game is what we can do today, this week, this month to move in this direction. So it could be something simple like invite a procurement officer to a planning meeting. The long game is how we're collectively changing the conversation and the evidence base for digital government, bringing more of the public sector into these discussions and getting these sorts of discussions out into the wider public sector. But I'd also encourage people to think a little bit about what I like to call Trojan horses, which are actions that feel like short game and a concrete activity that happens once, but that have a really solid snowball effect over time, or maybe the impacts are not the obvious ones, but they're the most important ones. So for instance, I think Canada signing on to the Digital Nations is an example of a Trojan horse, where it's a commitment and a statement that happens once, but it has a long tail of effects on how we view commitments. And we can pose things as, oh, like in line with our commitments to the Digital Nations progress and that direction, we should do this differently, or we should incorporate this initiative. So it's the sort of thing that has knock-on effects over time. Alternatively, and more tactically, let's say you have an invitation for a presentation to speak about a service transformation project. You could choose to delegate that invitation up your hierarchy, and in doing so, a more senior executive would have to really learn what made that service transformation project work and what made it tick. And that's the sort of thing that like, I'm not saying that I would do, but I would. You've probably heard this phrase from Mark Andreessen's book, Software is Eating the World. When we got our learning designers and our faculty together to talk about everything that we've learned over the last 3 years, probably the biggest theme that we came up collectively was actually something more like this. Soft skills are eating the world. There's this arc that organizations seem to go on where they start with a digital leader and a digital vision, and they have a bit of a direction. Then they start realigning policies and procedures in that direction. But what we heard repeatedly is that even in organizations that get to this point, people feel a disconnect between the vision and the policies and the procedures and behaviors. And when you think behaviors, you might think things like, oh, like whether we're incorporating testing or the role of design in our decisions or the way decisions are getting made. But when we talk to people about it, we actually heard things more like this: control and ego, and trust and courage and confidence, curiosity, vulnerability, and empathy, which are just very deeply human emotions. And that's what people were saying they found that they were running up against. They actually boiled it down to that level where they were thinking that it was their boss's trust in them to take a different approach, or the ability to think about someone else's needs outside the organization and picture it in a different way. And then when we flip this from our learners to our faculty, so this is a quote from one of our associate faculty, who is someone I consider to be a digital leader from a different department who works with us. They said, there's nothing quite like having learners get to the point of shifting from intellectually understanding theories behind service and digital to asking themselves the important questions about their own personal ability to shift their own behaviors. I.e., it's somewhat of a slow, reflective point to get to some aha moments where it's not, oh, this is how this works. It's coming to a point of almost dawning about the fact that you need to look and act and think about things differently to be a part of this the way that it needs to go. And so we try to nudge that along. So in the Digital Accelerator, we send our students down to the cafeteria and get them paired up with a classmate they don't know very well. And they take a good amount of time to interview each other and work through who their stakeholders are, who are the people that are on the other side of a service or a project or an application, and what those people are thinking and feeling and hearing, and going through basically an empathy map. Trying to help people go on that slow reflective journey to those aha moments. But I think the other thing we can think of as an implication from this is often in the digital space, we think about disrupting and pathfinding, and that people need to get with the times. And that may be true, and I think sometimes definitely is true. But these sorts of comments would also might suggest that no, we actually need to think about how we engender trust by communicating the process, and how following a process in a certain way will lead to the right outcomes over time, or how to spur someone's curiosity for what is possible through a different approach. Because really, when people are using terms like this, we're talking about the most basic human psychological needs in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and where we may have some digital leaders that are a few steps up this period, it's sometimes easy to forget that the people you're trying to have follow along behind you may be a few steps down and on a completely different page from you. Next is that the massive open and free learning ecosystem is a double-edged sword. It's amazing that you can take the most niche problem in the most niche software and Google it and find a forum where 20 people have figured out this problem and solved it and are having a back and forth about it. If you want to learn Python, you can find any number of free websites with any starting points for any purpose. And that is an amazing feature of our times. But we hear two things about why this doesn't really work in terms of digital learning for government. The first one being that people don't know where to start. So in 2018-19, we actually started trying to curate the open internet with a bit of a bias towards resources that were in French and English and bilingual. And we tagged hundreds of resources with whether they were French or English, whether they were beginner and advanced, what domain they were in, and tried to give people a bit of a way to walk through a really good set of learning. And what we learned is that that's still overwhelming. And so we took a bit of a different approach in the end, where we take more so 8 to 10 good learning resources, and they might be blog posts or podcasts or self-paced courses or instructor-led courses. They might be third-party or external or ours. And we give people a learning path. So this is our Discover Digital Leadership learning path, which is about 17 to 22 hours. And it's a very simplified, somewhat one size fits all, but it's a pretty good bet for something that adds up to a pretty good introduction to the topic. The second thing that we heard was that digital does not necessarily equal digital in the government, legal, policy capacity, and infrastructure context. It's not a straight line port of practices, even from organizations that are really successful in this space. So where in 2018-19, we started by doing some courses on development and DevOps and cloud, we found that we couldn't really hit the need. And the more interesting question that wasn't being solved by the open and free ecosystem was how to actually do any of these things in the Government of Canada context. How do we have to think about strategy different as the public sector than we do in the private sector? Things like that. So that's kind of where we've gone to focus over time. The other thing I'll note is that sometimes there's a specific Government of Canada context, but sometimes there's just a public sector context that is different from the private sector. So this is a website called GC Share that we made, CSPS made, not just the Digital Academy, credit where credit is due. And so mostly with municipalities, provinces, and territories, but also some other governments and some not-for-profit organizations. We're trying to create a bit of an open ecosystem of learning. So we're putting as much of our learning content here as possible and encouraging others to do the same. Next is that quick consumable learning has more reach and in-depth action learning has more impact, which I think is a pretty bomb-proof statement. But in 2021, I think many of us have a sense that we're all busy, that there's too much content. We need things that can fit into our lives. And that's why our first product out the door was called Bus Rides, with around the idea of content that could fit into like a commute length chunk of your day. And people need podcasts they can do while they're grocery shopping, which I think is just asking far too much of people. But when we surveyed 6,000 people about what they need from learning, hands-on workshops, on-the-job learning, and were the most popular formats that people requested, and blogs and podcasts came in dead last. It's the same with our Digital Accelerator, which is one of the programs we hear has the most impact in people's lives. So this is a much simplified view of that schedule that you saw earlier, but it's 2 full weeks of team and skill building, 3 weeks of design discovery, and then 5 weeks of additional skills, prototyping, and demos. And that's the length that has real impact in people's lives. The most popular course we have now, and one of the most highly reviewed, is called Modernizing Public Services for Managers, and that's a full day. And we were originally worried about putting a full day course in this day and age, thinking that people couldn't afford that much time. But people are actually soaking it up, and I think there are 2 reasons that is happening. One is that it actually is enough to be useful. It's enough time in that content to actually be something that you can apply to your job in the days and weeks that follow. And we have a version which is called Discover Digital for Executives as well. That's a bit truncated. The other thing is that it gives people enough of a block that they have to plan around it and go out of their workflow and not try to fit it in around everything else they're trying to do. And it gives that time for that more reflective arc towards aha moments, and putting things in your own context and thinking things through. And I think that's really powerful. And incidentally, there are sessions coming up in French on November 18th and English on December 1st, and then it will repeat ad infinitum in the new year. So there's an obvious trade-off here between quick consumable learning and in-depth action learning. Is we can't get the CSPS Digital Accelerator, which is a really great program, to thousands of public servants. It just doesn't scale. So in many ways, we still have to rely on quick consumable learning. But there's one thing that happens to be true of both these things, which is that any learning during workflow is what works best and where we get really positive feedback from learners. So you've probably all had the experience of trying to figure out how to do something in Excel. You look it up online, you immediately implement it, and then you can do that thing forever. Same thing in the accelerator. We basically teach people how to build Kanban boards and product backlogs as they are literally doing it as a team for a product or project for their department. And we find in our feedback that that is somewhat where the magic happens. And if we look at both our own learning content and what people react to, as well as the case studies that we're collecting from other departments and where they say they're having successes, the promising practice might be product management, where we as a learning organization, we get people for 10 weeks max as learners, and normally it's more like a few hours. We can't produce senior designers, we can't produce senior developers. There are some things where learning isn't quite enough, and we actually have to turn to recruitment and procurement and organizational design decisions, and we only become a pretty small piece of the puzzle. But product management seems to be a spot where you can take a team, a project or product manager, the team around them, and nudge them towards a few different practices with a little bit of learning and get much improved outcomes fairly quickly, with learning as a tipping point that sets people on a new path. And so that's something that I would put as a promising practice. And unfortunately, I was told that I can't ask you questions right now. So we'll have to do that in Wonder afterwards. So I had to skip that slide. Next, the more digital we get, the less the word digital makes sense. And I think this is a common theme in our community, where typically we talk as digital matures and evolves. It's more about connecting with service and policy and the rest of the organization, being a strategic business partner to the organization. And that's true, but I think there's still sometimes a sense that it started with digital, but as it becomes more mature, it's breaking out into the rest of the world. So I'll quickly explain our process as an organization. So we take those requests that you saw the list of at the start, but then for each learning product we make, we do really detailed action mapping of what learners literally need to do in their jobs to be successful with the learning that we're providing. And then when we reflect on our content at the end of this, it doesn't actually sound like digital, and it doesn't really sound like internet era. And I think it's probably a fairly bad idea to take one of the most successful people in public sector digital and criticize their work based on a tweet from 5 years ago, but here we go. But this is a very common definition that people tend to bandy about. It's digital applying the culture, practices, processes, and technologies of the internet era to respond to people's raised expectations. But as I said, when we look at the content that we provide based on doing in-depth learning needs analyses, and what we tend to be providing even though our name is the Digital Academy, really it's more about applying a set of proven and promising practices for organizations that draw from 20 years of lessons learned about literally just what works. And that's true whether we're talking about policy or technology or service or design or data. And I think it's the fact that it's really drawing from us as a community trying tons of stuff for the last 20 years, or looking at organizations that are trying things and incorporating it and building on it, regardless of whether the word digital or internet is in it at all. And the fact that it really is an evidence base is something that we undersell as a community. Next is that there are no startups in government. I think in recent years, the sheen has come off the cultures and the work practices of Silicon Valley, and we're looking to them less for inspiration and looking at them with a bit more wariness now. But I think there's still a thread that digital needs to do things differently and disrupt and sometimes move fast and break things. The problem is that when you build a culture around moving fast and breaking things, you'll attract people who break things. And unless that's paired with a really deep appreciation for why our institutions are designed the way they are and why the rules are the way they are, you may find that you'd wish that things had gone unbroken. Because by definition, there are no startups in government. There's government in government. We have that legal and policy environment. We are responsible for respect to democracy and sound stewardship of public funds. But two, and perhaps more importantly, is a phrase that we would have heard it for 15 years past called make the right thing the easy thing. If you consider your organization to be the thin end of the wedge for digital government, it's far better to make a path in a way that other organizations can actually follow, subject to the same legal and policy environment. A lot of digital success stories get things done through exceptions and fast tracks and workarounds and executive air cover, which is great because it gets things done, but it doesn't scale well. So better to do things in a way that's replicable and to change the organization around us rather than just break through it. And so I'd actually like to add up a few of these. So as I said, I can't see you, so I don't know whether you're nodding vigorously or storming out. But if you generally agree with some of the things I've said, we can add a few of them up. One is that digital in the government context is a bit different. The second is that it's about a series of lessons learned over the last 20 years, and that it's important to do things in a way that people can follow. And this is going to seem like a really convenient perspective, given that I'm talking on behalf of a digital learning organization. But I think what this adds up to is that we need public sector leaders to show others how they did it. That is, because digital in a public sector context is different and sometimes more difficult, the people that have found the path need to show it back to everyone else and make sure that we can scale the success that we're having. In the DA, we do have mechanisms for this, like associate faculty, including at the executive levels. We can chronicle case studies of digital successes and failures and communicate them and turn them into learning content. But regardless of whether you go to us for this principle or not, I think it stands is that these people who are some of the most in-demand people or teams or organizations who will never run out of work to do still have to actually pause their forward progress and make sure that they're leaving a trail that others can follow. And this is going to seem possibly unnecessary, but I'm now going to almost caveat a number of things that I have just said by noting that best practices may only actually be best for the organization that developed them. When we look at best practices, we see something really cool that an organization has done. And I really tried to find a visual metaphor other than a cliche iceberg, but it worked better than anything else. I'm sorry. So behind these best practices, what we actually find is it's really deep management commitment, and it's years of optimization. It's the right expertise, it's the right alignment, and it's also forgetting about 1,000 other organizations that tried to be Amazon or Google or Basecamp, and we don't talk about them because they didn't make it. So basically, if an organization that doesn't have all of the conditions for success that the organization that made the best practice has, generally speaking, you're going to get between 1/3 and 2/3 of the value of the way the best practice works in their organization. You're going to come in a distant second place at best. And to put this in somewhat real terms, a lot of people consider spend control to be a best practice in the digital space, i.e. Project gating and having oversight over major IT investments. And that can be the best friend to digital government by making sure that the right decisions are being made, that they're interoperable, and that the teams implementing them have the right capacity to do so. However, I think you can equally imagine that if you have the wrong 12 people running your oversight committee and making your decisions about project gating, it becomes the worst enemy of digital government. So I think ultimately what that means is that we have to design for the organization in the context that we have, not the one we wish we had. And here's the point. The further we go on our individual journeys of understanding and maturity, the better we can sift through the many, many, many things that we hear as public servants about where public sector digital should go. And the better we can make those incredibly contextualized decisions about what promises and what pitfalls and when and how, and make them in a way that are right for our context and our organizations. Thank you.